Welcome back to the deep dive. We are jumping into a really fascinating exploration today. It's one that, well, it really challenges how we think about something that feels universal but is actually incredibly complex.
It is. We're talking about the nature of crime
Yeah.
and how we even try to understand it. It's a deep dive right into the foundations of criminology, pushing us to question our assumptions, look at it from, multiple angles.
And right at the start, we absolutely want to acknowledge that the material we're navigating today, it's based on documents made available for educational purposes by the University of London.
That's right. And this conversation, this whole deep dive, it's designed purely for educational use.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic contribution to learning, and we're using it as our guide for this discussion.
And we're really proud to say this exploration is brought to you by Sinorbit Academy, Sri Lanka.
We genuinely hope that digging into this material with us proves really valuable as you engage with your studies.
And speaking of studies
Yeah,
and looking ahead, we also just want to say good luck for all of you for the exam.
yeah, definitely good luck. We know this material is key, and our mission here is to really unpack the complexities presented in the sources in a way that makes sense and hopefully sticks with you.
Yeah, our goal is to help you unpack your own assumptions about crime, see its deep historical and social roots, understand the big debates around defining it, grappling with that tricky idea of whether a science of crime is even possible,
hmm
and really appreciate why a global perspective is just essential today.
So think of us as your guides. I'll sort of help steer us through the different points and concepts from the source material.
And I'll provide some deeper analysis, try to connect the dots between these ideas, and highlight why they matter.
Exactly. We'll navigate this landscape together, drawing out the key insights so you can build a really solid understanding without feeling like you're just, you know, wading through dense text on your own.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, let's start by looking inward, which is actually where the source material kicks off in section 2.1, titled Developing Your Criminological Imagination.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting straight away because it makes it personal. The material says, look, everyone comes to studying crime from a particular place, right? You bring your own unique assumptions, your life experiences, maybe biases shaped by your background, culture, history.
Right, so the fundamental starting point it asks you, the listener, to consider is, where are you located? What are your experiences that have shaped how you instinctively think about crime or criminals or justice?
We all have this built-in perspective, don't we? Our own personal criminological imagination, even before we open a textbook.
Exactly. And the sources immediately take that personal starting point and contrast it with how criminology has traditionally tried to define itself. Like a common definition, maybe from a few decades back, like the one from Hall Williams in 1982, is simply that criminology is the scientific study of crime.
Seems straightforward enough on the surface, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Science studying crime.
Yeah, what's the issue?
Well, the source material quickly shows that this simple definition is actually loaded with problems and deeper questions. Like, what does scientific really mean when you're studying human behavior, social stuff,
Okay.
and maybe even more basic? What actually counts as crime that this science is supposed to study?
And the source gives a pretty shocking example of how narrow that definition could be. Hall Williams himself, using that definition, apparently suggested that huge historical events like the Holocaust shouldn't be studied by criminology.
Yeah, he thought they belonged more to history or political science.
Wow. That's quite something.
A really unsettling thought, isn't it? If you take such a narrow, state-focused definition, only studying what the law in a specific place calls crime, then something horrific on the scale of the Holocaust, a state-backed atrocity, could effectively fall outside the academic study of crime.
So it could almost become, in this weird academic sense, what Baudrillard called the perfect crime, a crime that leaves no trace within the discipline meant to study it. It just disappears from the field's focus.
Exactly, that's the risk. The source links this historical narrowness partly to the influence of positivism and its connection to what's called mainstream or administrative criminology.
Okay, positivism. We'll come back to that, I'm sure.
Definitely. But the historical tendency was to tie criminological study very tightly to what the state officially defined and measured as crime. You know, theft, assault, burglary, the stuff recorded by police and courts.
So criminology's job was basically dictated by the government's legal codes and paperwork.
In that traditional, narrower view, pretty much yes, it was seen as providing scientific backup for the state's efforts to control crime. But, and this is crucial, the source makes it very clear that today, many, maybe even most, criminologists strongly reject such tight boundaries.
Which naturally opens up a huge debate about the core concepts. If it's not just state-defined crime, what should criminology study?
This is where that criminological imagination really gets stretched. Should we stick to crime as the law defines it, or broaden out to deviance behavior that breaks social norms, legal or not?
Or what about social harm? That sounds much wider.
It is. It could include things like systemic poverty, corporations damaging the environment, unsafe working conditions, things that cause massive suffering but aren't always prosecuted as crime.
The source even mentions breaches of human rights. That would definitely bring state actions into the picture.
Absolutely. That puts state atrocities firmly on the table. Or maybe the focus should shift entirely. Maybe look at social solidarity, how societies stick together, how those bonds form and break, and how that relates to social disorder. These are all competing ideas about the fundamental subject.
And this argument over what to study must really affect how criminologists see themselves, right?
Totally. Are you supposed to be a detached, impartial scientist observing from afar? Or are you more of an engaged, critical commentator, maybe feeling you to challenge power or speak for certain groups?
It sounds like a real tension.
It is. And David Matza, who the source mentions, captured this brilliantly with his distinction between the correctional perspective and the appreciative perspective. It's a really helpful way to think about the underlying goals of studying crime.
Okay, let's pause on those. The correctional perspective.
Right, the correctional perspective. Matza argued that a lot of mainstream criminology historically took this view. The reason for studying crime, implicitly or explicitly, was to find its causes so it could be corrected, reduced, eliminated. You study crime to get rid of it.
Like treating a disease.
Kind of, yeah. It sees crime as a problem to be solved, a pathology to be cured.
And the appreciative perspective.
The appreciative perspective is different. It tries to get close to the subject, whether that's crime, deviance, the people involved, to understand it purely on its own terms. It's about appreciating the reality, the meanings, the motivations, the context, without necessarily aiming to change or fix it.
So more about deep understanding than fixing.
Exactly. Deep, maybe even empathetic understanding. That distinction, studying to fix versus studying to understand, really highlights the different motivations buzzing around in criminology. And underneath all of this, as the source points out, is the constant, unavoidable question about the state's role. If the state defines crime, how independent can the study really be?
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
And this complexity, pulling in different directions, different ideas about what to study and why. It's why criminology is often described using that metaphor from the source. A basket.
A basket. It sounds a bit informal.
Well, it reflects reality. It's not some perfectly organized toolkit. It's more like a container, a basket, where all sorts of things have been tossed in over the years. Writings from sociology, psychology, law, history, economics.
Different kinds of data, too.
Oh, yeah. Statistics, life stories, ethnographic notes, methods borrowed from all over. And crucially, perspectives with wildly different starting points, often painting completely opposite pictures of what the crime problem even is and how we should look at it.
So it's definitely not one single unified discipline.
Far from it. The source notes, this is why criminology sometimes has a mixed reputation, an ambivalent self-image. It holds everything from views that sound like pure common sense to ideas that are radically critical of the whole system.
Can you give us a flavor of the range of views you find in this basket?
Sure. On one end, you've got the law and order folks. They often see crime as a breakdown of personal responsibility, a lack of discipline. Their focus might be on needing stricter rules, worrying that societies are going soft, blaming failures in parenting or schools, a lack of moral fiber.
So the problem is individual failure, the solution is more control.
Pretty much. And then at the other extreme, you have critics who say, no, the problem isn't the individuals, it's the failings of modern society itself, especially the lack of social justice or breakdown in social solidarity. For them, crime is just a symptom of deeper issues like inequality, discrimination, alienation.
And some researchers might focus very narrowly.
Yes, maybe just on the interactions that lead to violence between individuals, micro-level stuff. While others use criminology as a platform for much broader social or political critique, taking strong moral stances on state power, inequality, capitalism, explicitly rejecting that whole idea of being a value-free scientist.
And even among those who see it as science, there are still differences.
Big differences. Some strive for that detached, value-free science, collecting objective data. Others see themselves more as applied social engineers, using scientific knowledge to actively intervene and fix the crime problem, often working closely with government.
And the methods differ too. Some want numbers and equations.
while others want rich, detailed stories. They want qualitative accounts of offenders, of subcultures, trying to present people not just as statistics, but as complex humans, maybe desperate, maybe exciting, flawed, alive. They want the human story.
This really brings out that tension between the traditional or mainstream role and the critical role within criminology.
Definitely. The source describes traditional or mainstream criminology's role as often being about providing accurate information for state officials. Lots of statistics, studies trying to find the causes of offending, what they call etiological studies, often modeled on natural science methods.
Which critical scholars might see as a bit tame.
Or even submissive, yeah, just
Mhm.
providing tools for state power without questioning the bigger picture. Whereas critical scholars position themselves differently. They might, conceptually at least, side more with the groups the state targets. They might attack state overreaction or try to shift the whole conversation away from state-defined crime
But what's what?
towards concepts like abuse of human rights or social harm, especially harm caused by powerful actors, the state itself, corporations.
And their theories can be quite varied.
Hugely varied. You get grand theories like Marxism, linking crime to capitalism, or micro-level stuff like symbolic interactionism, looking at how labels like criminal get applied and how people internalize them. They might explore cultural meanings or even use existentialism to understand individual choices.
And the source notes that traditionalists might find these critical approaches a bit too political, or maybe not scientific enough, perhaps over-romantic.
It's a real fault line within the field, and it looses right back to the start. The source is really pushing you, the listener, to think about your own starting assumptions in light of all this. Do you lean towards law and order, social justice, numbers, or stories? Knowing where you begin is step one in developing that critical criminological imagination.
Absolutely. Understanding your own lens first. Okay, let's shift now and follow the source into section 2.2, which helps put criminology itself into its historical and social context.
Yeah, this section is vital. It stresses that criminology isn't static, it's evolved. And you need that historical sensibility to really get why it looks the way it does today, why these debates even exist.
There's a quote here from Ortega y Gasset. Man has no nature, he has only a history. The source applies this to criminology itself. Studying criminology is studying its history.
It really is. It's the history of modern Western societies wrestling with huge questions. How do we maintain social control? What's the role and limit of state power? How do people become part of society socialization? And how do we deal with behavior we label as crime or deviance?
But the source makes a really crucial, maybe uncomfortable point about many traditional histories. It talks about histories of absence.
Yes, this is powerful. It highlights what's often missing. What about the massive historical realities of slavery, war, imperialism, colonialism?
These were world-shaping forces for centuries.
Absolutely. Yet the source says most criminology textbooks have been pretty silent on them. To really understand crime and justice globally, and even to ask the questions that truly matter today about power, inequality, harm, we have to consciously think about these huge historical blind spots when we look at how criminology developed.
It implies the whole framework might be limited if it ignores these massive parts of history.
That's the implication. It's a call to widen our historical view. Now, within the more formal history of criminology, Section 2.2.1 lays out that formative distinction between two major schools, classicism and positivism. Foundational terms, we need to repeat those. Classicism and positivism.
Okay, classicism first, 18th century, thinkers like Beccaria, Bentham.
The core idea of classicism comes straight out of the Enlightenment. Humans have free will, they're rational. People make choices by weighing up pleasure versus pain. Crime happens when someone rationally calculates that breaking the law is worth it.
And society is seen.
Often through the lens of the social contract. It's like an agreement. People give up some freedom for protection and order. So breaking the law violates that contract and hurts others' rights.
And governing under classicism.
Is seen as a moral and political task. The goal is a just legal system that deters crime by making punishment fit the crime, proportionate, swift, certain enough to outweigh any potential gain. It's about rational laws.
Okay, then comes positivism. Late 19th century, figures like Lombroso, Ferry, very different picture.
Completely different. Positivism ditches free will for determinism. It argues human behavior, including crime, is determined by causal factors, biology, psychology, social conditions. The social bond isn't a philosophical deal. It emerges naturally from social forces.
So it's not about choice, it's about external or internal forces pushing people.
Exactly. It's about finding those causes of crime. For positivists, governing becomes more technical, more scientific. Experts use knowledge to diagnose and treat the causes of crime in individuals or society. Law-breaking isn't so much a moral feeling as a symptom of some social pathology, like a disease needing scientific treatment.
The source points out a key difference in their underlying stance, the normative dimension.
Right. Classicism is openly normative. It's based on a philosophy of how society should be, social contract, and how people should act rationally. It makes judgments. Positivism, on the other hand, claimed to be value-free, objective science, just observing and reporting how things are based on facts.
And this idea of determinism is central to positivism. Let's repeat that. Determinism.
Yes, determinism. The source outlines different philosophical takes. Libertarianism says we have free will because determinism is false. Hard determinism says no free will because determinism is true. And then soft determinism tries to argue free will can exist even if determinism is true, often by tweaking the definition of free will. But for criminology, the big shift with positivism was that search for identifiable causes of crime.
The source then critiques what it calls the progressive picture, often found in older textbooks.
Yeah, some texts, like Vold's apparently, told this simple story. Classicism came first, based on old philosophy, then positivism arrived with science, and criminology just marched forward, getting closer to the truth about crime. A rational advance.
But the source says that's too simplistic.
Massively. It argues this progressive picture makes criminology seem like it developed in a vacuum, just refining its tools on a fixed reality called crime. It completely downplays the crucial practical link between how knowledge is produced and its socio-historical location. Ideas about crime aren't just neutral discoveries. They're shaped by the social, political, economic times they emerge in.
Which leads us right into the socio-political context, section 2.2.2. The source says this is often missed, but totally inescapable.
Exactly. Classicism wasn't just born in a library. It was deeply tied to huge shifts in Europe. The end of feudalism, the rise of rule of law states, the new power of the bourgeoisie demanding rights against the aristocracy, the creation of free markets needing independent actors. Classicism fit right in.
And positivism was also linked to its time.
Absolutely. It emerged with the spread of political power to lower classes, massive industrialization, the explosion of cities bringing new social problems. Positivism promised scientific, expert solutions to manage all this perceived chaos.
The source also links later trends, like neoclassical or New Right ideas from the mid-70s onwards.
Yeah, that was reacting to things like the perceived cost of welfare states, the puzzle of rising crime alongside prosperity, the growing rich-poor gap. These anxieties fueled a swing back towards individual responsibility and punishment, borrowing from classicism.
And today, the need to look beyond the nation-state.
That's tied directly to post-colonial realities, the lingering effects of empire and accelerating globalization. Crime and control just can't be understood solely within national borders anymore. But, as the source notes, the traditional criminological imagination, that state-focused way of thinking, still has a powerful grip, even when reality is changing. Jock Young's concept of the criminological imagination is key here, how our historical ways of thinking persist.
So we have these historical schools, classicism, positivism, linked to social change. But the overarching context for all this, according to the source, is modernity.
Modernity, yes. Repeat that, modernity. This refers to that huge transformation starting around the 18th century Enlightenment that fundamentally reshaped Western societies and eventually the world. It's the context for our modern crime control systems.
The source quotes Schill's description: modernity involves being advanced, rich, free from tradition, rational, rationalized, secular, believing in science, scientism, maybe even hedonistic.
And this huge shift shaped criminal justice institutions in key ways. Four are highlighted. First, the rise of the modern nation-state. We should repeat that. The nation-state.
Centralized power, bureaucracy, statistics, welfare systems.
Second, typologizing and differentiation. Sorting people, the poor, the mad, the bad, into distinct types, developing scientific knowledge about each with specialist experts.
Third, segregation into institutions. Let's repeat segregation.
Right. Building separate places like prisons, reformatories, asylums, mental hospitals to contain, treat, or punish these categorized groups. A key feature of modern control.
And fourth, later reactions against welfare and labeling ideas.
Yeah, push back, arguing against societal causes, putting blame firmly back onto the individual.
Though, importantly, the source also notes counter-movements within modernity, like restorative justice. Let's make sure we remember restorative justice. It challenges that state punishment model.
Moving into Section 3, drawing from Sections 2.3 and 2.4, the source digs deeper into modernity, but also its more problematic sides.
It reiterates that modernity means societies are just fundamentally different from pre-modern ones and how they hang together and control people. The old tight-knit community is gone.
Yes, but the source is also clear, citing authors like Morrison and Hopkins Burke, that modernity isn't simple or all good. It's complex, often troubling.
And it introduces this idea of a social crisis of modernism, sometimes using terms like ontological insecurity, a feeling of instability.
Yeah, deep uncertainty about who you are and where you fit in a fast-changing world. The source points to two broad features of this crisis. First, a crisis of power.
Meaning our technology and knowledge have raced ahead of our ability to handle the consequences.
Kind of, yeah. Think nuclear weapons. Think population growth straining the planet. Think ecological destruction. We have the power to create these things, but maybe not the wisdom or social structures to manage them properly.
And the second feature, alienation.
The alienating, maybe even nihilistic, effects of modern culture. Its focus on individualism, rationality, constant change can cut people off from traditional things, community, family, religion, that used to give life meaning and support. The huge move from villages to cities is a big part of this.
The source mentions Bangladesh, where village life is still strong for many, and global modernity can feel like an attack on their whole way of being.
Right, an attack on what feels natural, maybe their interpretation of Islam, for example.
And the modern city itself is described, paradoxically, living packed together with strangers but feeling distant.
Exactly. Surrounded by people, but often anonymous. This needs totally different kinds of social control than a small village where everyone knows everyone.
And our self-image changed too.
Dramatically. Identity shifted from being about your fixed place in a traditional order to something more internal, individualistic, what the source calls insulated individualism. Let's repeat that. Insulated individualism. Your sense of self feels more separate, defined by authenticity, choice, and looking at things in terms of ends means rationality, getting what you want efficiently.
Which creates a gap between us moderns and the taken-for-granted understanding pre-moderns might have had.
Yeah. Social contract theory, for example. Imagine society starting with isolated, free, calculating individuals. That reflects that insulated individualism. It's a very different starting point than seeing people as inherently part of groups and traditions.
Section 2.4 adds other features of modernity relevant to criminology.
Things like industrial society, capitalism, urbanism, liberal democracy, even utopian socialism as a reaction to modernity. But the source highlights subtler things too. How we handle time, and especially the idea of constant change.
Modern society isn't just changed, it's always changing.
Right? No settled, fixed structures like in traditional societies. Even big ideas like democracy keep changing in meaning and practice. Think about who gets to vote or low election turnouts.
The urban context gets stressed again.
Most people now live in cities over 20,000, historically unprecedented. Before the 19th century, it was less than 10%. London's growth, from 30,000 in the 14th century to 900,000 in the 19th, shows the scale. That density, anonymity, complexity, it fundamentally shapes crime and control.
And there's debate about the economic engine of modernity.
Is it primarily industrial? About production, or capitalist, about markets, profit, class? How you answer that shapes how you see social life, class, interaction. Do you see a functional system working together? Or inherent exploitation and conflict? These lead to very different ideas about crime's roots.
Okay, moving to Section 4, drawing from 2.5. This tackles the tricky relationship between criminological knowledge and just, well, personal opinion.
The source is very direct here. It admits studying criminology can feel like developing sophisticated opinions because, hey, smart people already have strong opinions about crime based on their values and experiences. Studying it involves testing your own ideas.
But it frames criminology as part of that big knowledge project of modernity. Let's repeat, knowledge project.
Right. This knowledge project, starting with the Enlightenment, aimed to replace subjective opinion, tradition, or authority with reliable, verifiable facts and science.
And there was often a utopian hope attached, using knowledge to build better societies.
Definitely. You see that in Beccaria, Durkheim, Lombroso, and especially explicitly in thinkers like Comte and St. Simon. They really believed science held the key to social improvement.
Auguste Comte, a founder of sociology and positivism, tried to create a scientific basis for reorganizing society.
He was really optimistic, utopian even, about positivism. But he also saw that this new scientific knowledge challenged the existing ruling class, who he felt had a monopoly on political opinion, thinking they alone knew best.
He's quoted saying, they assume they alone can see all right in politics, entitled to a monopoly of opinions.
Comte argued that secure social knowledge from independent scientists should break that monopoly. Society should be organized rationally based on science, not just the whims of the powerful.
And he had his famous law of three stages for how human understanding progresses.
Yes, Comte's law of three stages. First, the theological Victa stage, explaining things via God's spirits. Second, the metaphysical abstract stage, using philosophical concepts. And finally, the scientific positive stage, based on observation, science, laws. In this final stage, he thought science could even resolve moral dilemmas.
But, and this is a huge critique, the source points out the deep Eurocentrism in Comte and much traditional criminology. Let's repeat, Eurocentrism.
Eurocentrism.
Yeah.
Yes. It's the assumption, baked into thinkers like Comte, that Europe and Western ways are the peak of civilization, inherently superior, destined to spread globally.
And the source argues that the historical spread of the West, often fueled by this view, actually damaged or destroyed other cultures.
Right. That idea of progressive evolution glorified Western dominance, measured by technology and material control, while dismissing the value and resources, social, cultural, intellectual, of non-Western cultures.
And this Eurocentrism has heavily dominated criminology's history.
That's the claim. The source says it's incredibly hard to find non-Western theories that have really challenged the basic assumptions of Western criminology within the mainstream field. It actually encourages you, the listener, to actively seek out and use non-Western examples, if you find them, to challenge those assumptions.
Anthropology offers a strong counter-narrative to this Eurocentrism.
Absolutely. By studying diverse cultures worldwide, anthropology showed the incredible variety of human existence. Okay, early anthropology could also be ethnocentric, sometimes portraying non-Western cultures as primitive, but overall, it's a scientific project, trying to find the normal range of human life.
It actually ended up demonstrating diversity, not uniformity.
Exactly. It showed societies organize themselves in vastly different ways, but it also revealed our underlying unity as a species.
And it challenged the idea that primitive practices were just irrational.
Yes. It uncovered complex social structures, belief systems, rich non-state institutions that worked. Crucially, it undermined any basis for genetic inferiority. Anthropology shows every society has complex processes to create normal members.
And social order isn't some universal natural thing.
No. Societies differ hugely in how they control behavior. Norms about protecting life might apply only to your in-group, not strangers, for instance. How societies manage conflict is incredibly varied and learned.
The source then comes back to restorative justice as a modern example that flips that Western-centric narrative of linear progress. Remember, restorative justice.
Restorative justice contrasts sharply with the traditional state-focused criminal justice system, which is about law, guilt, punishment, often called retributive justice. Let's repeat that. Retributive justice. Retributive justice asks, what law was broken? Who did it? What punishment fits? The state owns the crime.
Whereas restorative justice asks different questions.
Totally different. Who was hurt? What do they need? What relationships are broken? What are the community issues? How can we involve everyone, victim, offender, community, to address the harm and its causes?
Howard Zerr, mentioned in the source, highlighted the inspiration from indigenous peoples.
Yeah, specifically First Nations in Canada, U.S., and the Maori in New Zealand. Restorative justice brings forward values and practices from these cultures that were suppressed by colonialism.
He mentions the Maori Utu system. Let's make sure we catch that. Utu.
Utu. Before Europeans arrived, it was a complex Maori system. Not just revenge, but about reciprocal balance, protecting people, maintaining social stability, group integrity, justice embedded in relationships and community.
Though the source adds some important nuances.
It notes some historical indigenous justice might have used physical punishments, clashing with modern Western ideas of dignity. But also that our main modern punishment, prison, is often experienced as deeply alienating and harmful by many indigenous people today.
So all this diversity, traditional state systems, restorative models, indigenous traditions, makes criminology really complicated.
It does. It's not just about controlling people or understanding processes. As the source concludes, it's also an inquiry into the consequences of what is and the possibilities of what could be for how humans live together and respond to harm.
That idea, inquiry into what is and what could be, is really powerful. Criminology isn't just descriptive, it can be aspirational too. Okay, let's use Section 5, drawing from 2.5.1, to look at how criminology's boundaries have blurred, especially with something like terrorism.
The source points out how things once seen only as politics or war are now being looked at through a criminological lens. The boundaries are definitely blurring.
The 9/11 attacks are used as a key example of this dilemma.
Right. The immediate choice was call these crimes by individuals or an act of war by an enemy. The decision, mainly by the U.S., was act of war, leading to the global war on terror.
Which had massive global consequences.
Huge. Invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, interventions in Libya, Syria, contributing to failed states that sometimes became terrorist havens. Plus, actions by Western powers' rendition, detention without trial, that, as the source bluntly says, smell of hypocrisy against stated values.
And the terrorist became this new kind of outlaw figure.
Often portrayed as irrational, purely evil, rejecting modernity almost beyond understanding, hard to fit into old criminological boxes.
But even with the war framing, analyzing terrorism increasingly involves multiple disciplines, including criminology.
Absolutely. Criminological theories get applied. You see attempts to use Durkheim's ideas of mechanical organic solidarity. Maybe terrorists seek a simpler, purer mechanical solidarity against modern complexity.
What other criminology concepts get used?
Ideas about poverty, especially relative poverty, distrust of institutions, frustration may be linked to enemy or status frustration, feeling victimized by own governments, by the West, marginalization, paranoia.
And crucially, ideas about learning, like Edwin Sutherland's differential association theory. Let's repeat those. Social learning and differential association associated with Sutherland.
Yes, Sutherland's differential association. The idea that criminal behavior techniques, motives, attitudes is learned through interaction with others, usually in close groups. This can be applied to understand radicalization within specific networks.
Still, the source admits it's incredibly hard to apply analytical frameworks to the extreme cruelty of groups like ISIS, the beheadings, killings, destruction, enslavement, the bravado.
It feels almost impossible to treat that purely as expressing valid ideas. The understandable reaction is to label them psychopaths, monsters, scum.
But crucially, the source says that labeling process itself is something criminology should analyze.
Why do we use these labels? What function do they serve? Do they help understanding or just other the perpetrators and maybe let us avoid harder questions about context?
The source brings in Richard Spencer's view from 2014, linking ISIL's terror back to the political culture of Iraq and Syria, even their colonial past.
Spencer argued the extreme cruelty, while shocking on video, wasn't necessarily new. It echoed decades of brutality by the Iraqi and Syrian states themselves and their colonial predecessors. Ordinary people reported similar horrors long before ISIL.
He suggested the public killings showed a need for momentum. Success breeds success.
Right. This connects to the Hobbesian idea that Saddam's fall created a vacuum, leading to chaos. But Spencer pushes back slightly, suggesting lawlessness wasn't just an absence of state power. Extreme violence was part of those states for years.
The source also mentions the idea that groups like ISIS might represent a return to pre-modern religious views.
And focusing only on modern factors might miss those deeper roots. This whole section highlights the complexity, the ongoing debate, and how topics like terrorism really stretch and blur criminology's traditional boundaries.
Let's bring it back now to fundamental concepts in Section 6, focusing again on crime and criminality based on Section 2.6.
And the source hammers home a point we've heard. Crime is not common sense, even though we use the word easily. Its boundaries are fluid, open to power plays, war, crime, terrorism. The lines blur.
Criminology, then, is the logos of crime. Let's repeat that. Logos of crime.
The rational dialogue concerning crime. But the source immediately asks, why only scientific dialogue? What about lay or common sense views? What are the limits of each? Is crime itself a scientific category or a common sense one?
It describes the common sense or natural perspective.
This is the view that crime is just, out there, real, observable. Criminology studies it. The law defines it. Convicts are criminals. Criminal acts are naturally antisocial. This view makes the world seem neat, institutions rational, processes reasonable. It avoids ambiguity.
But the source wants you, the listener, to probe this, to ask questions.
What processes happen when we label something crime? Does it change with history or culture? Is criminology itself tied up with deep human fears, emotions, attitudes about progress, trust, order?
And if it is, can purely scientific experts ever have sole control over understanding it or deciding policy?
Exactly. The source then directly asks you to examine your own presuppositions. Do you start thinking crime is a social problem? It's such a common phrase.
And if you do, does that automatically lead you to ask what causes crime?
And is the hidden goal then to cure society? Do you assume all crimes share some natural wrongness? Do you assume criminals are fundamentally different from normal people? And how does assuming crime is natural link to your attitudes toward criminals? These are meant to reveal your underlying criminological imagination.
This loops back strongly to Matz's correctional perspective. We need to repeat that, correctional perspective.
Yes. The source notes much historical theorizing was tied to this. Criminology was seen as practical cause and cure. Crime and criminals were real things out there, and the goal was to find causes to inform policies for removal or incapacitation.
It gives quotes from leading figures showing this practical goal. Read Zinovitz in 62. Combating crime is vitally important, an essential practical function.
Sutherland and Cressy in 78. The practical aim is broader, to reduce pain and suffering. Let's remember Sutherland and Cressy.
Read in 85 is more direct. Understand, predict, then control, eliminate, or prevent crime. Remember Reed.
And even Jack Young, from a radical viewpoint in 86, still saw a practical task. Seek solutions, substantially reduce the crime rate. Remember Young.
Comparing these shows a consistent focus on practical application, even with different nuances. Mostly focused on the nation-state, maybe shifting globally now.
And this brings us back again to Matz's idea from 1969 about needing to escape correctionalism. Let's repeat correctionalism. Matza argued that to truly understand crime and criminals, you have to break free from that ingrained correctional attitude, the focus on fixing the problem, often relying only on positivist science for causes and cures. Escaping it allows for empathy, getting closer, trying to see the world from their perspective. It opens up understanding beyond just control.
Let's move to Section 7, which looks specifically at the shift from crime to deviancy, based on Section 2.6.1. Remember deviancy.
Right, deviancy. The source explains sociological criminologists sometimes prefer deviancy because it allowed them to control the definition, using sociological concepts rather than relying on state legal definitions. They wanted to talk about a sociological fact.
Paul Rock, from 1973, is key here. Let's repeat his name. Paul Rock.
Rock argued sociological deviancy isn't about the act itself, it's about social qualities. Deviant is a social role, assigned through interaction.
So if society doesn't react and label someone as deviant,
Then sociologically, they aren't deviant in that situation, even if someone privately thinks they're odd or broke a rule. It's about their social meaning in interaction.
this leads straight to seeing deviancy and crime as a social construct. Let's repeat that. Social construct.
Social construct.
Yeah.
Fundamental idea. It means things like crime or deviance aren't just natural facts out there. They are interpretations people collaboratively create and assign to things through social interaction and shared meanings.
It's more than just interpretation. The source says they are the phenomena people create.
Yes. Quinney's quote captures it. A thing exists only when it is given a name. Any phenomenon is real to us only when we can imagine it. In our relationship with others, we construct a social reality of crime, conceptual and phenomenal, world of meanings and events. We need to remember Quinney.
So crime isn't inherent in the act. It's part of the social reality we build through naming, reacting, interacting. That social reality is the primary stuff for sociological analysis.
The source mentions Activities 2.1 and 2.2 to help apply this. Activity 2.1 asks you to identify deviant roles in your society. What are they? Why define that way? Whose interests are served? It's applying the social construct idea.
And 2.2 is about understanding the sociological concept of role and how Paul Rock uses it for deviancy. There are tools to see these concepts in action.
Finally, Section 8 brings us to interrogating your own imagination further and looking ahead, referencing Activities 2.3, 2.4, and sample exam questions.
Activities 2.3 and 2.4 are suggested as ways to actively challenge your thinking using readings and creative works.
2.3 points to a Morrison reading on defining crime. 2.4 suggests stories by Levi and Cortázar and the film Unwatchable to make you think about defining crime, witnessing, labeling, different perspectives on harm. They push you beyond abstract ideas to the human experience.
And the sample exam questions aren't for immediate answers, but signal the big debates from this material you need to keep thinking about.
They hit the core tensions. Question 1. Is criminology, or should it be, a science?
Question 2. Can it even be a science like physics if its subject crime is defined by shifting morals, politics, power, directly links to that social construct idea?
And question 3. Why is it so hard to agree on core concepts? which, as we've seen, is because the subject is contested, its history is complex and political, and that basket holds so many conflicting views.
These questions are really an invitation for you to keep thinking critically, keep questioning the obvious, and see the complexity beneath the surface.
So we've definitely covered a lot of ground in this deep dive using the provided material.
We started right with our own assumptions, questioning the definition of crime, how traditional criminology narrowed it, and how that's challenged today. We dug into the historical roots, classicism, and positivism, seeing them as products of their time. Remember, classicism and positivism.
We situated all this within the huge context of modernity, exploring its features and challenges, power crises, alienation, urban life, constant change. We looked at criminology as part of modernity's knowledge project, aiming for science but grappling with Eurocentrism and finding other narratives in anthropology and restorative justice. Remember, modernity and restorative justice.
We saw how criminology's boundaries blur with topics like terrorism, applying concepts like social learning and differential association. Remember, social learning, differential association, Sutherland. And we went back to basics, interrogating crime itself, moving from a natural view to understanding crime and deviancy as powerful social constructs. Remember, social construct.
The main takeaway has to be, understanding crime and criminology is not simple, not fixed, not agreed upon. It's deeply shaped by history, politics, social context, and it's full of competing perspectives. That very contested nature makes it challenging, but also, well, fascinating.
And here's something to really chew on, building on all that. The source talks about that modern knowledge project, the drive, from Comte and the positivists, for a science of society, of crime, to replace opinion with objective fact, aiming for control, for betterment. But then the material itself shows how crime seems fundamentally tied to, maybe is, a social construct defined by shifting morals, politics, human fears, emotions, cultural contexts.
So you're left with this major tension, aren't you? The powerful modern desire for an objective controlling science of crime bumps right up against the reality that the thing you're trying to study scientifically isn't stable and external, like a planet or a chemical. It's something constantly being defined, argued over, created, and recreated by human action, power, and meaning.
What does that mean for the dream of a science of crime? Can you really have a science of something whose very nature is so tied up in subjective human stuff and power dynamics? That's a big question to carry forward.
We really hope this deep dive has helped you unpack some of the crucial ideas and debates from the University of London source material, which, remember, is for educational use only.
And this deep dive was brought to you by Sinorbit Academy, Sri Lanka. Thanks so much for joining us. Keep digging into the material, keep questioning your own assumptions, and remember the complexity we've explored.
And one last time, good luck for all of you for the exam.